Well, we're still in the first section of Isaiah. That's chapters 1 through 35, which is almost exclusively outlined as being an area of judgment and condemnation for the nations around Israel, as well as for Israel itself. And we talked yesterday about chapter 18 being hard to interpret. Chapter 19 perhaps sheds some light on that in the fact that it deals with the Egyptian judgment and the fact that God would work in Egypt through different kinds of ways. Not necessarily major invasions here, but rather the drying of the Nile, which was a natural disaster, but also internal conflict, internal corruption. And between the two, during the 7th century BC, Egypt was in quite turmoil. But that leads us into the second half of chapter 19, which talks about an alliance between Assyria and Egypt and Israel in the middle, where they're all worshiping one God. And that's really kind of hard to understand unless you take the interpretation that some theologians take, which is that during that time from the 7th century BC, that after that came Christ, just 7 centuries later. And there was a number of people who were influenced by the birth of Christ, by his resurrection from the dead, and there was a breakout of religion in both the area that we would know as Assyria and Egypt. That may be the short-term view that Isaiah had, and it also may be a long-term view. Why do I say that? Well, remember the little chart that I've shown you many times about how the prophets saw mountaintops, and they didn't recognize that some were long-term and some were short-term prophecies. And there's no question here that this could be both a short-term, which occurred around the time of Christ, but also could be a long-term prophecy that there will be a worship in that region of one religion, and that may come about towards the end times. So we find God's promises fulfilled and the prophecy fulfilled not too long after Isaiah. I mean, Isaiah was writing some 500 or 600 years before Christ. Yet in God's terms of timetable, that's not an unreasonable length of time to think that it would be fulfilled in the 7th century BC. And then again, towards the end of time, there would be a revival, if you will, and that the major cities of Egypt would worship one true living God. In any case, we know, because we read ahead in the book, that we win in the end. There's a couple of interesting things that I want to point out in chapter 19 that you can go back and study for yourself. And that's that very often God uses calamities to bring about a healing. In verse 22, you'll see that clearly. And I think that's worthwhile for us to remember now as we see a trend perhaps in America that we didn't want to see. When we're calling evil good and good evil. Perhaps the calamity that's coming upon America is not to punish America, although that will certainly be part of the cause. But perhaps we're seeing it not just for punishment, but that we might turn back to Him, that there might be a revival, there might be salvation as a result of the events of the current history. That's certainly my prayer, is that God will use all that's going on right now to bring about a revival before the end times, and that many, many people will be saved and come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ, His ways, His standards, His values before the end, that many will not perish for eternity, because this calamity that has come upon America that continues to increase will finally bring many people to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And that's certainly my prayer. I have one other commentary to make today. I hate to be so political, and I certainly don't want anybody to think that there's any prejudice or bias in my heart. There's no question that this recent court case of police brutality and social injustice was one that brings our attention to that social injustice, and perhaps will bring about some training and some laws that will minimize the social injustice that occurs, not just to blacks, but also to people of less affluent situations. Uh, and there's no question this man should never have died under the brutality of the police officer involved. But at the same time, I hate the fact that this man is becoming a hero when in fact his lifestyle and his life values was not one of a hero, but one of somebody that had been trying to pass counterfeit money, who had been involved in drugs, who had not lived a righteous life. And I would much rather see people like Martin Luther King, people of that stature who had always peacefully worked for social justice and worked for equality. I would much rather see them as heroes than to see someone that's involved in the drug culture and counterfeit money and so on. So that's my 2 cents on the issue. I feel like there was social injustice there. I think that God will use it for good to bring about better social justice for people of color as well as people of lower economic incomes. And we'll always have some bad cops who use excessive force, who don't think through what the dangers are. The man was on the ground, he was handcuffed. Even if he got up and ran, he wasn't going far. Even if he got up and tried to fight, he couldn't fight very well with his hands cuffed behind him. So there was no need to continue to disregard his cries for help and that he couldn't breathe. At the same time, let's not make him a hero. His name will always be associated with social injustice, and that's good. But not to make him a hero as a result of what had transpired. And I think we need to always hold our police accountable, but we can't tie their hands where they can't enforce the law or where they have to give any group, whether it's wealthy or whether it's the blacks or the yellows or the reds, discriminatory treatment. There should be equal justice, and whenever a cop uses excessive force, does not think through a situation, they should be removed from that position, take that authority taken away from them. But we need to honor our police. We need to honor those that are trying to keep our country safe for all, and give them the tools that they need in order to enforce the law properly, and give them the restraints that will keep them from social injustice. Well, I got on my soapbox even though I said I wasn't going to do that. That's my thought for the day. God bless you and have a great day.